Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Jeremy Thomas, Amherst College class of 2021. I'm our current student body president and former chair of the Black Student Union. I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that Amherst stands on Nonotuck land. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We could not begin this event without acknowledging the slew of police killings in the past week alone. 20-year-old Dante Wright, 13-year-old Adam Toledo, and each and every one of the many thousands gone deserve justice. Justice is acknowledging that the police cannot be reformed, and justice means that the police must be abolished. I would be similarly remiss not to acknowledge the recent work of the Black Student Union. On Tuesday, 400 students joined the Black Student Union in an organized walkout to demand that the college take seriously the proposition that Black minds matter, take seriously its promise to tear us Aradian, and to make Amherst a campus worthy of all of its students, but especially its Black students. Once again, welcome to this spectacular evening and to Black Alumni Week. Tonight, as you know, we are in for a treat, a conversation between Dr. Kimberly Bain and Dr. Angela Davis. This evening would not have been possible without the work of many people, and I extend my gratitude on behalf of the Black Student Union to Student Activities, the Multicultural Resource Center, Tracy Wolf, Carol Alman Morton, Norm Joes, and the BSU's event coordinators, Kalaria Kali and Ernest Collins. Black students and alumni, please do not forget to join us throughout the week at all of the spectacular events we have planned. Without further ado, let's begin. Dr. Kimberly Bain is the John Holmes Assistant Professor in Humanities at Tufts University. She received her BA in English and Asian Languages and Civilizations from Amherst College in 2014. She went on to earn a PhD in English and Interdisciplinary Humanistic Study from Princeton University. In her scholarly work, her most pressing and urgent concerns have consolidated around questions of the history, theory, and philosophy of the African diaspora, race, gender, environmental and medical racism, and Black arts and letters. Her first book project, entitled On Black Breath, takes seriously the charge of I can't breathe, and considers breath as more than mere metaphor, rather as also a somatic and socio-political phenomenon that has resonance in the wake of enslavement to the contemporary moment. Her second book project, entitled Dirt, Soil, and Other Matters, built on her first project's methodological commitments to multi-temporal and non-chronological avenues of inquiry that trace the development and deployment of the mundane. Revising the impulse to read the middle passage as the singular heuristic for understanding Black movement, migration, and mobility throughout history, she turns to Dirt for understanding contemporary Black diasporic relations. Dr. Bain, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that wonderful welcome and also, description of my own work. I really appreciate it. So to begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So the land from which I join you all today is the traditional unceded territory of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts people, who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. Today, Boston is home to thousands of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful for the opportunity to live and work here. Yet the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory remains unresolved. The repeated violations of sovereignty, territory, and water, perpetuated and perpetrated by invaders that have impacted the original inhabitants of this land for hundreds of years, demands reparations. But the promise of justice does not need to come in a different time and place. It can begin here and now. I'd like to offer a couple of logistical announcements before we really begin, and I get to invite our wonderful esteemed guests to be in conversation. Today's conversation will have a Q&A at the very bottom of the screen. If you look at the live submissions area, it's sort of next to the box next to the live stream theme. If you have questions or if you'd like to drop comments, you're welcome to do so. Throughout the conversation, we will be collecting them, and then at the end of the conversation, we'll have time to actually respond to some of them. So I really do encourage you all, even if it's a sort of just a hype statement, or if you just like to drop a comment or a question, please do so. Tonight's conversation is going to be, I think, a really wonderful one. I'm going to be in conversation with Angela Davis, or more like I get the opportunity and the beautiful chance to be in conversation with Angela Davis. And I think the conversation is going to be particularly relevant for today's issues. I think, the recent killings of Dante Wright, as Jeremy pointed out, the ongoing trial of Derek Chauvin, the extreme police brutality and violence that has been ongoing in this country for hundreds of years, I think is something that's really going to be centering a lot of the discussions and the questions we're going to be addressing today. And I, hope you all can have some sort of input in it. So I really do encourage you all to drop questions and comments. But without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, the wonderful, estimable, amazing Angela Davis. So Angela Davis is a feminist and a writer, first and foremost. Through her activism and her scholarship over many decades, Dr. Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis' teaching career has taken her in very far-ranging places, from San Francisco State University to Mills College to UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, Syracuse University, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. And, the mentioning of all the different institutions she has taught at is actually sort of showing the kinds of what Octavia Butler would call earthseed that she spreads. She is spreading sort of, I think, way of moving through the world of some kind of abolitionist impulse through different institutions. And I think that's really amazing and something, I'm really excited to talk more about. Most recently, she spent 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now the Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of Feminist Studies. Angela Davis is the author of 10 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. And her recent books include Abolition and Democracy and Are Prisons Obsolete?, about the abolition of the prison industrial complex, a new edition of the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, and a collection of essays entitled The Meaning of Freedom. Her most recent book of essays, called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, was published in February of 2016. She is a founding member of the Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. And like so many educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to the educational institutions. And she has really helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex. And she now urges her audiences, which is going to be us tonight, to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. So I hope you can all join me in welcoming Angela Davis, despite us not being able to all see each other. And Professor Davis, thank you so much for being in conversation with us, for being here tonight. I know it's been, I mean, for so many of us, it's not just been a week, it's been a number of decades. It's been, a while that we've been really working through the questions and the pain, and I think the trauma of what it is to be in a society that really is so embedded in its carceral logics. And so I wanted to actually sort of begin the conversation by having us think a little bit about what abolition means, right? What does it look like today? What does it look like for our futures? Because personally, I think of myself as deeply pessimist, but I'm a pessimist with a lot of optimism. And my pessimism comes from optimism, and that optimism is that how there is a hope, there is a sort of abolitionist future we can turn to. But I want to just open it up and ask you, what does abolition look like for you? What does it sound like? What does it move like? What does it feel like? What could it be as we're thinking about, the sort of current moment, but also where we can go in the future?
Well, that's a very big question to begin with. We could probably spend the rest of the hour talking about the meaning of abolition. And I should tell you that I just submitted a manuscript with my 3 collaborators for a small book that's entitled Abolition, Feminism, Now. In the course of writing that book, first of all, it's really hard to write with 4 people. And I think as scholars, we tend to assume that the work is solitary work. And it's so important to have the experience of working with others, of constantly discussing and doing collective research. It's been an amazing experience, and we still love each other.
That's very rare. That's very hard to find. Working together with folks, it's just like things rub together,
But I think it's because all 4 of us, and it's Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, Gina Dent, and myself, I have been involved for a very long time in these movements. So this is, it's not simply our ideas as individuals, it's about attempting to generate the collective notion of what it means to struggle for abolition. But I would say, first of all, that people have to recall that abolition has been proposed within various contexts. There was the struggle against slavery, and there were actually people who argued that slavery could be reformed, that it could be transformed into a humane institution, that you could get the masters to be better masters. And of course, the abolitionists argued that slavery is not an institution that can be reformed. It has to be abolished in order for us to be able to move in the direction of some kind of democracy. There are abolitionist movements that have been in existence for a long time around capital punishment. There are those who argue that, well, capital punishment can be reformed. We can mete out capital punishment on a basis of equality. We can execute as many white people as we do Black people.
That's not a problem. Sure, right. Yeah.
But obviously, that makes no sense at all. And so we're applying the same kind of logic to the prison system, to the existing system of policing. And we know that there have been calls to reform the prison system for the entire duration of the history of the prison as the dominant mode of punishment. The response to calls for reform perhaps has been some changes, but if one looks at the larger picture, one sees that what has been produced throughout this history is a more permanent institution, is a more repressive institution, is a more racist institution. And as a matter of fact, the reforms have precisely helped to consolidate an institution that really is not capable of meaningful reforms. And the same thing is true of the police. I mean, there have been efforts to reform the police ever since the origin of the institution of the police. And we have to remember that the origins are actually in this country in slavery, the slave patrollers. So that, what we say is that if we want a better world, we will have to dismantle these institutions and not so much replace them, because then people think that we're using the footprint of the prison or the footprint of policing. What we're suggesting is that society has to be differently organized in order that we create conditions that no longer require the existence of these institutions of violence. So to be an abolitionist is to call for a better world, housing and healthcare and education and all of the things that human beings need, things that will hopefully ultimately make it unnecessary to use such violent institutions. So it's about a revolutionary trajectory. But at the same time, and I'm going to make one other comment, and because this has the potential of taking up all of the time. Abolitionism is also a way of being, a way of organizing. It requires recognizing that the future can be different. But at the same time, that we have to ask ourselves, how have we been affected by the existence of these institutions? How have we internalized the ideologies and the impulses associated with these institutions? And how can we begin to extricate impulses for retribution from our own emotional makeup? So it's about changing ourselves as we go about changing the world.
Yeah. I mean, I really love that too, because, one of the things I, frequently tell my students is abolition is a project of ending the world, right? And that world is the world that we live in and its logics, but also it's like the worlds that we have invited into ourselves. We have to invite new ones, right? Like creating new ones. And so I love that, what you're saying, like it is about a trajectory that we're on. And we have to, in order to get there, it's actually a process, an ongoing process. It's hard work, it's labor. It is going to be painful at times, but that's what growth is. That is what emerging from certain kinds of crossroad logics means. Like, in order to do that, you have to actually do hard work. And it has to be constant, And you can think about, just even thinking back to the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, right? Where thousands and millions of people, not just in the US, but also across the globe, were marching in solidarity and protesting, the sort of murder of George Floyd. And then sort of several months later, where people became fatigued and sort of just didn't find the sort of same impetus, and like reminding folks that how actually this is a long haul process that we're in, right? It's not just simply the one march we have to, think about, but actually extend this as a long-term goal of our lives, It's like work that we've got to do. And I was actually thinking as you were talking, one of the things that has been really, one of the things I think you draw out in your book, freedom is a constant struggle, and sort of Ferguson and Palestine, but I think also has been sort of part of the longer, as you say, revolutionary trajectory, has been sort of global coalition building, right? The necessity of that, right? We can't just, sort of in a reduced or enclosed sense of what it is to be within a nation. We can't think of ourselves as sort of siloed within certain nations. We have to actually think across borders. We have to sort of break down, I think, the divides that sort of are built up by virtue of imperialism, by virtue of et cetera, right? And I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about that in particular, about how we can understand and actually produce space for coalition building that's not just within sort of national boundaries, but across borders, that are international, across language, even when it's not really necessarily urgent to our immediate lives, or it doesn't feel urgent, right? I think it's always urgent to our lives, even if we don't recognize it, but when it doesn't feel urgent, right? And what does that look like, right? And in particular, does something like social media provide a space for that? Or does it actually fail us at certain crucial moments? I think these are questions that people were struggling with, way long ago, right? And I think definitely in the 60s, 70s, 80s, certainly in the 50s, when you have the Badung Conference, when you have all of these like Black intellectuals who are meeting together, and also not just Black intellectuals from the US and the Caribbean, but also meeting up with intellectuals and revolutionaries in Asia, et cetera. So I wanted to know, what is your thought about how we think about abolition or abolition of cross-road logics, abolition of racism, et cetera, all these things. How does that look in a global scale, right? How do we build community across nation? How do we build community across language? Are there platforms for building that right now? Are they providing the sort of ground that we need to actually get traction, or are there, impediments? And I can think of, there are many impediments, the way that that's just how capital works. Capitalism does its job of ensuring that how any sort of resistance that we might form is slowly incorporated into its machinations. But I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts about how the contemporary, in particular the contemporary moment, how does global networking, how does global coalition building really function? Is it really functioning in any way that's different, perhaps, than 60s, 70s, 80s?
Well, of course, I think it's rather ironic that during this era, when we have the technological capacity to communicate with ease across oceans, across borders, we don't do nearly as much of that that work of connecting as was done in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, when basically everything had to be done through snail mail, when it wasn't, when it was too expensive to make long distance calls. There was a vibrant internationalism. Of course, it had to do with the fact that there were communist parties all over the world, and those communist parties, had connections with each other, even if they had to communicate by letter. But there were many international conferences and agendas that were agendas for peace, for example, when one considers the role that women's organizations played in struggling for peace, and the role that Black women, like Lorraine Hansberry and Claudia Jones and so many others had in these international movements. So it's rather ironic that we have to build a new infrastructure, it seems to me, for internationalism that is different from the past, because of course we don't have the same kinds of party infrastructures. But at the same time, I think that if we make the effort, it's not difficult to reach out and connect with people in other places. For example, I'm a part of a project that is headquartered in Chicago. So we were talking about the fact that we needed some international dimension. All we really had to do was get in touch with people in Brazil, because there's a huge movement against police violence. There's a huge Black feminist movement in Brazil. And I don't understand why we don't have more interrelationalities with those movements, but we can do it, and it's absolutely necessary. We should recognize that there is a very strong movement against racist police violence in France now. And as a matter of fact, France is in the process of examining its long history of using universalisms as a way to prevent people from thinking about the concrete and the ideological impact of racism and Islamophobia. So I think that we in this country could benefit from participating in those debates and, watching the ways in which other people engage in struggles against the militarization of the police. Palestine is another question. If we want to know where this militarization of police departments all over the country emanates from, look at the role that Israel has played in training police departments to engage in the same kind of maneuvers that ended up killing George Floyd. So absolutely, I think internationalism is so important. There's so many issues, issues around immigrants, ways in which we have to think about protecting the planet or preserving this planet as a place that will be around, for the next period, so that if we win any of these social justice struggles, there will be a place for people to be able to enjoy those victories.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. Literally nothing that we are doing is going to actually make a difference if we don't have a natural earth to actually land on and have, at the other end of the day. And you're so right. And I'm also really glad you brought up France because, of course, as you're saying, they've enjoyed a long history of masking Islamophobia under the sort of guise of secularism, but also there's been a lot of, I guess, attribution of the sort of revolutionary impulse, the sort of protests that are on the streets right now in France, to universities in the US and leftist politics, and sort of leftist professors who are out here, spewing the sort of whatever agenda it might be in, France's ideas, as it were. And so that really brings me to the question, right? And so as we're thinking about how do we build worldwide coalitions, right? One of the things that, I think you have been so great about teaching others about, not just in your work, but in the actual practice of your daily, existence. But I think also we can look back to history as sort of pointing to this, is the importance of building communities of intellectual struggle as well, right? Where you're actually contributing ideas to each other, working through, tough texts, thinking through these questions, and actually that is actually the work of dreaming what the future is, what abolition looks like on the other end, right? And I think the sort of radical imagination of those kinds of spaces is actually really crucial. And so I guess my question is, sort of somewhat, so there's a two-part question to this then, right? So on the one hand, we have this, attack, not just in France, but also in the US, on the university as the sort of site of breeding, quote unquote, abolitionists, leftists, politics, and that being the sort of downfall of civilization, et cetera, et cetera. We can think of all of the sort of scaremonger tactics that are used. And so I guess what is your thought? What do you think the role of the university is, or at least not even the university as an infrastructure, but rather spaces of learning and teaching in sort of revolutionary or abolitionist growth, in revolutionary abolitionist practice? I think oftentimes these happen outside of the university, and I can think of, for example, No Names Book Club. That is something that has really blown up recently, or not even that recently. I mean, it's been around for a little bit now on Twitter, where the rapper No Name is actually, encouraging folks to join her in reading, really crucial, important abolitionist Black texts, and then having conversations about it, and, sending free books to folks who can't afford it otherwise, sending books to the folks who are currently incarcerated. And so that's actually a space, I think, that is modeling certain kinds of genealogies of what it means to be in coalition, what it means to be in community with others who are committed to sort of not just abolition of, the sort of ending systems and structures, but also ending systems and structures that live within us, within our sort of own responses to what, the society does, our own responses, our own reactions to how we relate to others. But where do you think that space sort of fits into this? And I can think also too of the fact that unions were so crucial historically for sort of helping build the revolutionary impulse, and the ideas of communism are really important. And now, sort of the dismantling of unions has actually also dismantled those kinds of spaces. We can even think about how Black spaces of sociality have been dismantled over the decades, right? And how those spaces were so crucial to developing certain kinds of the ability to connect, to share networks of knowledge, to build new kinds of, futures that we imagine. So where does that exist now? Like, are there spaces like that right now still going on? Where do people find them? Are they actually siloed or sort of secreted within, or sort of working from the underground in institutions like the university? I'm thinking here of like Fred Moten's, perhaps, of the undercommons, right? Where are the undercommons where we can actually gather? What do they look like? And then also, if they are within the university, at least in some parts, I don't think all of it, but if they're in some sort of small parts of the university, where we have scholars and intellectuals who are also committed abolitionists, how do we, if there is a tension, how do we rectify the tensions between, I think, those two positionalities of being both an intellectual who teaches theory, who talks, about literature, or who reads really difficult texts with students, and then also what it means to be an abolitionist in the sense of trying to actually move systems of power. So it's kind of a two-part question there. Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, intellectual work is absolutely essential.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in that respect, the work that we do within universities is essential.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to a group of students in the Black Student Union at Amherst before this event.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the points that I was trying to make was that we have to learn how to work within contradictions. We have to learn how to inhabit contradictions. We cannot allow conflict and contradiction to deter us from doing the work. And as a matter of fact, contradictions, as Audre Lorde pointed out, can often be productive and creative. And so as someone who has spent the vast majority of my life on the campuses of universities, people often ask me, how can you spend time in such a reactionary space? And I pointed out, I've been, first of all, any space can be potentially a terrain for struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I see the university in the very first place as a terrain of struggle mm-hmm. over ideas, struggle mm-hmm. over who gets to participate in the production of ideas, struggle over the acknowledgement of the epistemological value of other spaces, and pointing out that sometimes the struggle for interdisciplinary programs is a revolutionary struggle on the campus of the university, where the traditional disciplines are still the anchors of university education. And it's only been in the last 50 years or so that we've seen the development of really important interdisciplinary approaches to knowledge, Black studies programs, Indigenous studies programs, feminist studies, cultural studies, all of those fields that have studies at the end. And I think that that struggle to guarantee that we preserve these new ways of engaging in the production of knowledge is absolutely essential, because it also means that we can construct interdisciplinarity in a much broader fashion, in a much more capacious way. And we can recognize that interdisciplinarity is not only about the existing disciplines, but it's about acknowledging other sites for the production of knowledge. For example, the field, critical prison studies, the foundational knowledge for that field comes from people who are incarcerated, intellectuals within prison. And I think we have to learn how to see the prison, this institution we want to abolish, also as a site for the production of knowledge. Abolition, as we know it today, was really first raised dramatically during the uprising of the Attica brothers in 1971. I think the university is valuable, but it's valuable to the extent that we acknowledge it as a site of subversion, a site of struggle, and intellectual struggle matters. I was happy to hear about the demonstration that took place last week at Amherst. Black minds matter. Minds matter. Knowledge matters, and knowledge actually should be connected to processes of transforming the world, because it seems to me the value of knowledge can be measured by the extent to which it helps us to create a better place, not only for humanity, but for all of our non-human companions and for the entire earth. I think intellectual work is essential. We cannot succumb to the kind of anti-intellectualism that assumes that things happen, simply because of a kind of action that is not informed by thought and by understanding and the kind of deep apprehension, not only of what is, but of what can be in the future.
Yeah. I wanted to snap the entire time you were talking. I mean, I've been wanting to snap the entire time, but, got to restrain myself from doing that. But you're so right. And I think about that because, I think so many of us, the question of imagination or like radical imagination, which I always turn to when I, speak to my students, and also just thinking about my own sort of way of moving through what knowledge is, what epistemology is, what learning and teaching is. Like, I think radical imagination can only emerge from struggle, and like radical imagination is necessary to think about what abolition is. And it's through the sort of struggle of reading and trying to improve. And it's through the struggle of actually being in a room with others, right? If we allow it to be a space of struggle, if we allow it to be a space of growth, that we actually can really build, I think, really wonderful possibilities. And there's something I find to be extremely beautiful about those moments where you just sort of see it and you're just like, that was what I was missing, or that was what was like the hump that I needed to get over in my own sort of thinking around what is possible, and breaking the rules and all these things. And it really makes me think, as a small side note, I was once teaching a class and I had my students, we were playing that game Trouble, the board game Trouble. It's, you've got different colors, and you've got a little bit of a little button in the middle you press, and each person goes around the room and everything. And I think about that game a lot because I was playing with my students, and I set up these like arbitrary rules. I was like, the blues can only go every 5 turns, or the greens can only go every 1 turn, et cetera, et cetera. And they all went around, they just played the game, and they all got frustrated, as one does when there's inequality and when there's like, unfair logics, set up in a game, because everybody's competitive, even if they won't admit it. And at the end of the game, I was like, okay, so what do you guys think? And everyone's like, oh, it's really terrible, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, yeah, that's true, it's really bad. And they're like, oh, this is a really poor analogy for like what it means to be in a racially unequal, society. I was like, yeah, that's true. It's analogy can be really terrible sometimes, et cetera. And then one of the students was just like, but actually, none of us had to actually listen to those rules you set up. And I was like, that's it, what does it mean to actually sit there and to rethink what the structures of the world is? And like, you can only do that, I think, when you're actually in conversation with others, whether it's on the page or with others in the classroom. if we allow it to be that kind of space. And that's just really beautiful. We're right about at time to start taking some questions and comments from the audience, but I wanted to ask one last question from me. This is my own personal one. Are there organizations or books that you want to hype for us as things to check out, to donate to read, communities to get involved with? Like, what's on your mind of late? That's something that you would want to share with the audience for us to look at. And then I'll, turn it over to everyone else's questions.
Well, I see these struggles that so many people have been drawn to over the last period. I would say since the emergence of Black Lives Matter, so important. And of course, there's been a flourishing of new books and new ideas and new organizations. And I think that everybody should try to contribute, join an organization or become connected. Read books. I could probably spend the rest of the time we have allotted just offering the names of authors or the titles of books like Robin Kelly and Miriam Kaba and Adrienne Marie Brown and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor but also let's think about issues that aren't so central to our understanding of the kind of abolitionist moment. What about disability? Liat Ben Moshe has an amazing book, which is entitled Decarcerating Disability, which allows us to understand the ways in which the treatment of disabled people has helped to consolidate systems of incarceration that are involved in the production of the prison industrial complex. There's some amazing films too, popular films and films that aren't so popular. There's one that you may not have heard about by a documentary by Gilda Shepherd. It's called Since I've Been Down. Have you seen that film?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so powerful. If you want to understand the meaning of education, the meaning of knowledge, watch that film. I told her I'm still haunted by the words of this young man who taught himself how to be a teacher and was teaching his brothers in that prison because they weren't allowed to participate in the regular course curriculum. And he said, when I'm teaching, sometimes I almost feel free. I remember that line. It lets you know how important, again, in relation to the question you asked before about intellectual work, how important it is for people behind bars to discover the joy of learning and knowledge. Then I actually like Judas and the Black Messiah. I think that's a popular film. Of course, there are a lot of things that one could be critical of, but I think it's important that people recognize that we're doing this work along a trajectory that stretches back and that will move forward. And as I said before, not only get involved in organizations and perhaps create new ones on college campuses. I just recently read an amazing book by a philosopher, young man from Martinique, and it is called Decolonial Ecology. And in the book, I don't think it's been published in English yet. It exists in French, and it's about the connections between assaults on on the planet, and misogyny and racism, and how environmental justice is not about adding environmental concern to existing justice struggles, but recognizing the interrelationality from the very outset. So yeah, we could continue discussion
Yeah,
forever.
we're going to. Don't worry about it. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the wonderful questions that our audience members have provided. I'm just going to start with a question that was offered by Jesse Wilcox. The question was, what was helpful to your ability to reconcile a call for abolition, knowing that meant not calling for cop convictions? And I think that is a real important and I think extremely urgent question, particularly right now, given the Derek Chauvin trials going on, et cetera. So what is your response to that question?
We have to be strategic in developing abolitionist agendas. And of course, people have been calling for the conviction, the arrests, the trial, the conviction of police who commit these horrendous murders. And this has been going on forever. And as long as I can remember, as long as I've been active in the movement, I can remember these calls to convict the police. And well, of course, a few of them have been convicted. But even if they're convicted, what's going to change? I think what's different in this moment is that even though we are watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, and we're focused on the ways in which these issues play out within the legal system, there is an increasing awareness of the fact that that's not going to change anything. So what if he is convicted? And unless we think about justice as retribution, as vengeance, it will have little or no effect on what happens in the future. Now, I'm not saying that these people shouldn't be rendered accountable. They certainly should, but we have to figure out other modes of accountability for individuals who engage in these terrible, violent assaults. And we have to perhaps use a much broader framework to think about what can we do in order to guarantee that this does not continue to happen. It has happened over and over and over again. They can't help themselves. They can't even help themselves in Minnesota. So, it's, how is it that someone can kill Dante Wright as the trial around George Floyd's death is unfolding? So I think these are clear messages that we have to, even if we feel that we may experience some emotional satisfaction from someone being convicted, we have to figure out what is going to bring about lasting change and how we can imagine new modes of justice, new forms of justice, non-retributive forms of justice, restorative justice, transformative justice, at the same time as calling for the creation of conditions that will likely minimize the possibility that the police will continue to do this, to engage in these actions that lead to such tragedies.
Yeah. This question comes from, I will go with, so the question comes from Madison Green. So I think this ties into what you're just saying, right? The question is, for people who don't understand why prisons should be abolished or transformed, what would you say? And I think tied into that is the question that comes in from Michaela Boxley, who's asking also, does pushing for reform, because abolition seems currently unavailable or unfeasible, detract from the ultimate goal of abolition? And I'm just thinking, even from those two questions, the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, and how calls for abolishing the police were in many ways restructured around defunding the police, right? And now, of course, we have politicians who are calling for none of those things to happen, right? So what are your thoughts around, like, how do we speak to folks who don't quite understand why prisons should be abolished, who call for, like, who will protect us then? And then how do we deal also with the sort of slow ramping down that occurs when we have folks who call for abolition, and then the message that gets transmitted is actually a message of reform or a message of defunding rather than radically changing? Mm-hmm.
Well, changes don't happen overnight. Mm-hmm. Radical change in general happens as a consequence of a continued engagement. I was telling the group before that sometimes we feel like we're broken records because we say the same thing over and over and over again. And then we get upset that change doesn't happen. Sometimes we do have to sound like we're a broken record. We have to, I feel like I've been saying the same thing since 1970. Since I first became aware of the possibility of using an abolitionist framework. But I know that there arrive these moments, these conjunctures that are not predictable. And such a conjuncture occurred in the course of the pandemic, when people began to recognize the structural character of racism finally. How many times have we talked about structural racism, institutional racism, systematic racism? And it didn't begin to stick until we could see that people were dying in indigenous communities and Black communities, precisely because of the structural racism of the healthcare system. And the fact that people of color were acknowledged as the most essential workers in our society. This could have never been predicted. But I've always said that we have to act as if those moments will arrive in the future. And we have to do the work we're doing in order to prepare for such a moment. When suddenly people who have been hearing us, over and over again, and who just weren't moved by it, didn't get it, but suddenly there's a kind of epiphany that happens, and they remember all of the things that they've heard. And so, I think it's so important to recognize the protracted character of this struggle, that you don't know whether the work you do now is going to have immediate consequences. You don't know how long it is going to take for it to have consequences. But if you're serious and dedicated about doing the work, and I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about communities and collectives and creating legacies and passing the work down to the generations that come, then change will happen. This is what we witnessed last summer. And another thing, I think it's important to realize that movements don't always unfold within the context of the most dramatic expressions. So just because millions of people aren't out in the streets again, although quite a number of people are out in the streets in Brooklyn Center in Minnesota, but that is the mobilizations, the demonstrations point to possibilities, and they don't constitute the movement per se. They constitute the demonstration that a movement is in the process of being organized. And so a lot of the work happens in spaces that are not so public, in spaces that are not so dramatic. Mm-hmm. And I think now this is precisely the time when we need to do the work of encouraging institutions to identify the ways in which they have been involved in the reproduction of racism. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not going to be in the news. That's not going to be broadcast everywhere. It may be on social media, but not so much. But that is the real work of transformation. And, let's recognize that just because we're not being acknowledged by the media, that the work we're doing is not important. So, I think this is the time when we really should be involved in doing the transformative work. As the students walked out a couple of days ago at Amherst and had a set of demands that they're presenting to the administration. That should be happening everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. This question comes from Dorothy Nketia. The question is, as an out lesbian, how do you see us going about integrating the needs of Black queer community members in this movement? And I think we can think about, for example, how Black trans women are amongst some of the most brutalized by police brutality in the country, et cetera. Also how, Black queer theory, if we're thinking about it in an intellectual sense, actually structures certain ways of thinking about sociality or theorizing sociality. So how do you think through this sort of space for Black queerness within the movement and actually grounding the movement, considering, of course, the long histories of Black revolutionary struggle being historicized as being sort of very male-dominated, masculinist at times. Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the really important contributions of the Black Lives Matter movement has been to propose new paradigms of leadership and to propose new paradigms of leadership within the context of a feminist engagement with the intersectionality of struggles. And so for the first time in the history of Black struggles for freedom, you've seen movements emerge with queer Black women at the forefront of those movements and incorporating struggles around sexuality and as you pointed out, the emphasis on recognizing the importance of supporting especially trans women of color who, as you were pointing out, suffer more forms of violence than any other community of people. So if we are truly interested in ending violence against women, gender violence, then we have to recognize that it's trans women who are the ones who deserve to be most supportive. And this has to be, these issues have to be in the forefront of our struggles. Oftentimes it's assumed that we gauge the importance of our struggles by the quantity of people involved. And if you say that trans populations are relatively small, but the work that can be done in support of issues involving trans communities is going to have an impact on everyone. And I always like to point out that if it had not been for trans activism, we would not be in a position to so effectively challenge the binary structure of gender. And if we learn how to challenge the binary structure of gender, we learn also how to challenge the strictures within which sexuality has been contained. And then we also, learn how to engage with other aspects of our lives that have been deemed normal within the context of existing ideologies. So that teaches us how to engage in ideological struggle around a whole range of issues. And that's why this period is so exciting. And I think it may be for those of us who are a bit older, to point out to those who are a bit younger how exciting it is to be alive at this moment. And especially for young people to grow up with these, new and revolutionary approaches, how that is going to have an impact on the future.
That's right. That's so right. Okay, we've got a couple more before we wrap. So this question is from Anonymous, but the question is about bridging the gap. So how do we bridge the gap between notions mainly present in academia that lack accessibility to the general public? So how do we, take terminology that's oftentimes, coined by academics and intellectuals that are a little bit more opaque, I think, for general public that we're trying to also work in tandem with toward abolition?
Well, I like to think in terms of translation because there's so many different languages, and if someone speaks, say Wolof, and someone else speaks I don't know another language in the world, German, you wouldn't expect those two people to be able to automatically communicate with each other without some mediation, without some form of translation. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for those of us who have studied at universities and are scholars to recognize both the importance of the kinds of technical vocabularies that we develop, but at the same time, the need to translate those ideas into more accessible ways of thinking for those who don't have that preparation. There's nothing wrong with not being able to understand someone who has studied, anthropology for years and years. There's nothing wrong with not being able to understand that specialized language. But the anthropologist has to recognize that it's her responsibility to try to place her ideas or express her ideas in ways that are accessible. I should tell you that years ago, when I was involved in the creation of Critical Resistance Conference, and we insisted that every panel be composed of people who would be able to speak across boundaries, across disciplinary boundaries, across boundaries of that separate activists and university people. So we ask everyone to pay attention to their mode of expression, and even for activists to recognize that as activists, we have vocabularies that aren't necessarily accessible to people who haven't been doing the work. And so to think deeply about how to convey those ideas in different ways. This is often hard for scholars because, they have a hard time thinking outside of the context of the theories and methodologies and vocabularies that allowed them to produce the ideas that they have. But if we can't engage in that translation, then what really is the value of the work if you can only talk to those who are closest to you or who have been trained in the same way that you have? I think it's a major challenge. It's an important.
It is, and as scholars, it's an ongoing challenge. It's part of the work. Okay, we're at our last question, and it's going to be 2 questions rolled into one. So the questions come from Ella Hendricks and Ellie Hong. And so the question is, what keeps you motivated to continue the work of abolition? What in your life gives you strength? And then Ellie's part of it is, what gives you hope, for the future for abolition, et cetera?
For me, this current moment is a very hopeful moment. Despite all of the violence and the tragedy, but the fact that so many people now are aware of the fact that there's work to be done is very hopeful to me as someone who has experienced periods when very few people, it seemed, were really listening. I don't know how many times I was confronted with the idea that I had to be really out of my mind to be talking about abolishing prisons. How can the world exist without these institutions? And I'm hopeful because I see that it's possible for people to come around, for something like abolition to enter into public discourse, which I never thought would happen in my lifetime. I knew it would happen eventually, but I never imagined being able to actually witness this process myself. And to me, that's a reason to be hopeful. Of course, one does not do work in order to receive public credit for it. That's not why we do this. We do this because we're concerned that human beings and our non-human companions should have the ability to live lives that have some joy and some happiness. And so I've been smiling a lot lately because it's just amazing to hear young people talk in a framework that I would have never expected. It used to be that I mentioned abolition, and how many people are familiar with it? Hardly anybody, but now everybody is, which means, of course, that we have to continue to do the work to keep the level of understanding high. And we don't want abolition to become simply a way of expressing disgust with existing systems, but it has to have the quality of encouraging people to engage in a collective imagining of a very different future, and pointing out that it is possible now to engage in anti-racist work, anti-misogynist work that is going to have an impact on our futures and the futures of those who come after us.
Yeah. That was a beautiful, I think, way to wrap up this conversation. I think on a message of optimism, an optimism that is a very realist and very grounded one, based on, not just historical movements, but also, I think, the real work that young youth who are out in the streets and also who are just learning and at home are really, pushing forward, and the importance of that sort of shared language that's being built. I think that's really beautiful. We're fortunately, unfortunately, out of time tonight. I thank you all, to the audience members, for hanging out with us and joining us in this conversation. And of course, thank you especially to our wonderful and esteemed guest, Professor Angela Davis. I hope you all have a wonderful night. And to Professor Davis, I hope to see you very soon. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.